Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss the role of rhythm in Finnegans Wake. This is a really elusive element of the text that has been enrapturing me lately as I'm considering the importance of performance and vocality and the sonic with regards to Finnegans Wake, because I recently just did a selected recitation of the entirety of Finnegans Wake, and as I was going through it, I was really seeing, just because I had to give a solid, concerted effort to explicating the text, the importance of rhythm, the way that it relates to the different voices in the text, and that different voices have different rhythms. For example, there is a continual motif, which is primarily, I guess, both rhythmic and melodic, in a sense, of a repeated tion suffix. So ululation, sublation, culmination, and this is a signal that the four, or the judges, or Mama Lujo, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are speaking. And they have a primarily juridical idiom through which they talk, and it's highly technical, hence the usage of tion over and over and over as a suffix. And you'll have a concerted string of maybe, at the most, maybe 20 instances of tion words, which is wonderfully ironic and funny, but it's also extremely rhythmic, and it compels you to sort of recursively and repeatedly think about the importance of, as Deleuze would call it, difference and repetition in terms of Finnegans Wake. And in this lecture, I would like to weave in a couple different theorists, including Boulez, Deleuze Guattari, Gerard Manley Hopkins, John Milton, and more, in order to talk about the importance of what Finnegans Wake has to say about rhythm, because it seems to me that it is giving us a larger picture of the importance of identity and change, and in particular, we see here Joyce privileging orality and vocality, and the performance of language, and in so doing he is privileging time over space. And this is a notorious battle of sorts that he was having with his contemporary Wyndham Lewis at the time. And Wyndham Lewis is critiquing thinkers like Joyce for privileging time too much, and he says that this leads to all sorts of absurd consequences, and Joyce actually interpolates this voice of Wyndham Lewis ironically into Finnegans Wake at different points. We can actually see Sean voicing the thoughts of Wyndham Lewis fairly often and critiquing Shem's temporal-oriented writing and thinking and style of argumentation and speaking. So in this lecture, I would really like to team out what are the differences between temporality and spatiality as we see them in Finnegans Wake, and what are the larger sort of things that they have to say about rhythm and therefore about music. Now, one of the most helpful starting points for thinking about rhythm and Finnegans Wake is the refrain chapter from Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, where they discuss this differentiation between rhythm and meter, which they're taking from Pierre Boulez. They say that meter is dogmatic, but rhythm is critical. It ties together critical moments, or ties itself together in passing from one milieu to another. It does not operate in a homogeneous space-time, but by heterogeneous blocks. It changes direction. They continue, the action occurs in a milieu, whereas rhythm is located between two milieus, or between two intermilieus, on the fence, between night and day, at dusk, twilight, or Zwielicht, hexaity. To change milieus, taking them as you find them, such is rhythm, landing, splashdown, takeoff. A milieu does in fact exist by virtue of a periodic repetition, but one whose only effect is to produce a difference by which the milieu passes into another milieu. It is the difference that is rhythmic, not the repetition, which nevertheless produces it. Productive repetition has nothing to do with reproductive meter. This is the critical solution of the antinomy. There's a lot of context that I could add here. You can check out my lectures on Deleuze and Guattari if you want more specificity. But what's most important for us is this distinction that is being made between rhythm and meter. And meter is something that happens in music where you take the music and you segment it into bars. and these bars are oriented and structured by a meter. 3/4 time, 4/4 time, 6/8 time, 9/8 time, whatever it may be. This accords a metronome beat to a specific note value so that you can, for performance's sake, orient and really discursify your music performance, because you take it and you give it a solid structure within which and through which the music can develop. But Pierre Boulez was critical of this. He said, I don't know about this privilege or this assumption that has happened in classical music where we assume that meter is utterly necessary. So in his compositions, and you can see this all throughout his oeuvre in his earliest works, such as the Second Piano Sonata, where he is in fact showing that we can do without meter, that meter is a sort of dogmatic way of overriding the potentiality for a wide differentiation and plurality of gestures and reducing them to some sort of common essence or formula. And this is something that both Deleuze and Guattari, and by extension Joyce, are trying to critique, is this idea that we have to essentialize all gesture, that we have to break it down to a common element that remains throughout. Deleuze and Guattari's point here is that in fact the importance of rhythm is that it manifests a in-between space. It manifests a transitionary progress, which is always a work in progress. And as we know, Finnegans Wake, as it was being serially published in, among other places, Transition, was called Work in Progress. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's quite funny that it was published in Transition, because rhythm itself is the transitionary moment par excellence, right? And just as an example where we can see Boulez actually talking about this, in the remarks at the beginning of the Second Piano Sonata score, he says, giving here a rough translation, that we need to pay extreme respect to rhythms and silences, and that the measure bars are merely here to be considered as visual aids. That the meter is extremely irregular, that all the bar lines indicate merely metronymic indices, and that really it can only serve as a sort of general tempo. And if we look on the page of the score, we can see that there are bar lines, but the note values across the bar lines are not consistent. Usually in music they are. So what Boulez is trying to do here is he's saying that, okay, we have certain conventions which require repetition, or in Deleuze and Guattari's language, territorialization. It allows and forces us to build a sense of comfortability, a home where there are codes and expectations that we can use and come from a space of familiarity to a space of unfamiliarity. And Deleuze and Guattari's point is that this territorialized space is imposed after the fact, that multiplicity and excess is primary, and discourse comes along the scene as a contingent historical creation to rein in the chaos. And Boulez is trying to bring back in that chaos. He's saying, okay, how much of the floodgates can I open up where, okay, the performer still has some sort of basic means by which to perform the piece based on our history of how we look orthographically and performatively at the music and figure out how to make it come alive. And Deleuze and Guattari are concerned with how we can allow rhythm to supersede meter, how we can allow for blocks or zones of intensity, as they call it, to push through, and in a sort of Lacanian way, to allow the real to protrude beyond the symbolic. Right? We have an attempt here to express the real that is erupting through the symbolic by opening up a space of articulation, development, and, most important for us, différance. Right? Because différance is coming from Jacques Derrida, and différance is a mix of differing, as in to be different, and defer, as in to defer an opinion or a judgment. And it squishes these two together, and it says that, okay, the fundamental method by which language occurs, it is the fundamental sort of baseline Brownian motion intensity that allows for language to work, is this quality of différance. That language only works because it is consisting of a number of elements which are different from one another. And Derrida says this is indicative of spatiality, right? Because we have to have a field of difference which creates an open space of articulation. And then also deferring down the signifying chain, which happens temporally, right? This takes time, it takes development. It forces contingency into the domain, and it prevents us from privileging a single plane developing, instead showing that underneath and sort of imbued throughout the plane is always an excess that is proliferating in n dimensions, as Deleuze and Guattari will often put it, that it exceeds beyond a single essential dimension and instead shows multiplicity to be the rule. And all of this is really important for understanding Finnegans Wake, because we see a multiplicity of styles and idioms and discourses and voices, and most importantly for us, therefore, rhythms that are taking place. We can see that certain rhythms are constitutive elements of certain idioms. Take, for example, the opening of chapter 1.5. In the name of Anna the All-Merciful, the ever-living, the bringer of pluralities, hallowed be her eve, her sing-time sung, her rill be run, unhemmed as it is uneven. Right? This is a mix of the Bismillah, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, and the Lord's Prayer. And it's taking these idioms and keeping in mind that the reason we can identify that it accords with and references those mediums in a sort of mix between irony and pastiche. I'm really not sure to what extent Joyce is making a differentiation there. It is using that because we can tell that the rhythm is common, right? The way it lilts along and the way that it messes with our expectations, with the way that language is constantly deferring its opinion, that way we are allowed to have some sort of fetter, some sort of hold on the language by being able to keep a rhythm in common. Therefore, Joyce wants to privilege time and rhythm over spatiality and this idea of territorialization, which is, of course, primarily concerned with a finality of articulation, the idea that we can take and lay out on one spatial plane, which is itself unitary, everything that is, and that we can essentialize it and discretize it and locate it. That we can opt for clarity, and that we can see everything in a sort of innocent presence where it occupies this space just as it is, irrespective of discourse or mediation. And this also carries with it a sort of optocentrism, this idea that space is something that we survey with the eyes, and hence this is going to be something that is talked about in the visual arts very often. How can this optocentric gaze be resisted? But Joyce wants to focus on the temporal, which focuses on contingency, on iterability, right? That everything plays out with a little bit of difference. This is one of Deleuze's key points, is that every repetition carries with it a little bit of difference, otherwise it wouldn't be able to be recognized as a different repetition, as a repetition and not the original, which it is repeating. Also, this carries with it revision, which is a sort of self-reflexive capacity of language to fold back over itself and think about its temporal contingency and sort of try to redo what it has already done. We get a sense of progression, and therefore I think of chord progressions in music, and I think of motivic progression in music. Joyce is playing very strongly on musical themes and the way that music uses rhythm in the way his language uses rhythm. And it's also concerned, this last temporal element, with anticipation, with a quality of knowing that the future is imminent in the present, and that the past is also latently carried over into the present, that it cannot be effaced totally, that it maintains a historic trace of sorts, even if this is a sort of surface effect that we're constantly trying to negotiate. But in Joyce, we can see how he's making a differentiation between the techniques and the capabilities of temporality versus spatiality. And with his privileging of temporality, we have the hope that language can be fundamentally connected to or indicative of or a manifestation of the real by virtue of its connection to the content in the form. This concern between form and content is something that we can see, for example, in the very first essay of our examination round his factification for incamination of work in progress, the sort of first concerted critical effort regarding Finnegans Wake when it was work in progress, and in Samuel Beckett's infamous opening essay, Dante Bruno Vico Joyce, he discusses how form is content and content is form. That these are part of the same thing, that every articulation of a presence is at the same time différance. And of course, he's not using this language, I am. But it is constantly demanding a temporal awareness of what are we hearing and what is the importance of orality to the way we look at Finnegans Wake. And one of my favorite passages for this is on page 74. It's at the end of chapter 1.3, where we are seeing the physiological and psychological process of falling asleep play out on the page, and the language's rhythm mimics this physiological and psychological and, we could say, narratological process. He says, Liverpool, sot a bit of it, his brain's cold parritch, his pelt nassy, his heart's a drone, his blood streams a crawl, his puff but a piff, his extremities extremely so. Fengless, Pembroke, Chimblamed and Baldol, Humph is in his doge. Words sway no more to him than raindrops to Rethfernham, which we were like, rain, when we sleep, drops, but wait until our sleeping, drain, stops. Right? And we can see that on the page, he is instituting periods more and more often as we get through the passage in order to show the importance of rhythm and the fact that it mirrors the content that is going on. So this mix is part and parcel of understanding the rhythm of Finnegans Wake. That rhythm is not a sort of happenstance, but it is the privileged way by which we can experience development and progression. And one of the ways that I think is really pertinent to understanding the implications of Deleuze and Guattari and Boulez that I've just been talking about, these ideas of zones of intensity, which we can really see in the music of Boulez, where he's trying to develop these sort of sonic forces that act in concerted blocks to deliver a particular affect. We can see this on the opening page of Finnegans Wake with the infamous thunder word. Baba badal gerachta kamina ron con bron twan tronaron trova harnon skun tohorder nenternuk. Right? So it is a 100-letter word which consists of a number of different words. For thunder, plus Baba badal is Babel, the Tower of Babel. So we have this fall from the Tower of Babel associated in the Viconian schema with God's thunderclap, which scares humanity into submission after their attempt to sort of concertedly create communities. And this is part and parcel of rhythm in Finnegans Wake, that it often appears in solid blocks or chunks, zones of intensity, which have their own internal consistency, or endoconsistency, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, and existency, a consistency relative to its neighboring milieus. And neither of these are objective, because as soon as we experience something affectively and immediately, like, for example, the recitation I just gave you of the thunder word, it is then interpolated and always at the same time being interpolated and interpreted and mediated through a number of different discourses. And this doesn't do away with affective immediacy, but it does mean that affective immediacy is always qualified by the necessity for différance, for an unfolding not only spatially, trying to lay everything out interpretively and figure it out on one plane, but also temporally, the fact that it is deferred down a signifying chain and demands development. And there is a ground of sorts by which the rhythm of Finnegans Wake works. And I really like how Stuart Gilbert, in our examination, in his essay, Prolegomena to Work in Progress, says that the word building of work in progress is founded on the rock of petrified language, of sounds with solid associations. And Joyce wants to accept the concrete, palpable idea of language that Gilbert is invoking. But critically, he wants to resist the stultification or petrification of language through discourse, through a single discourse, which reduces language to some sort of essence. Right? Think about the way that language works in English. There are thresholds of acceptability for vocabulary and accent and stress and tone, and all of these inform what is acceptable within English. And Joyce sees this, of course, as a problem because it has political implications. It is exclusionary and reductive. But through the implication of multiple discourses and showing that, in fact, any single discourse is fraught with holes and is itself partial, in the sense of being biased and gap-laden and incomplete, he shows that the solution to essence is plurality and multiplicity, which requires performance, tempo, and rhythm. It requires time, and it requires us to think in a way that is self-reflexive and obsessive and neurotic. Additionally, in our examination, John Rodker's essay, Joyce and His Dynamic, he writes, "Here it is as though the words held in solution the elements, inarticulate in both reader and author, which we call dynamic. For thinking is first affective. Words make it flesh insofar as they serve to define feeling. But beneath all words lie affective contacts, which might, it would seem, entirely dispense with words as signs, but not as sounds." And this idea of affective contact and immediacy is something that Joyce wants to try to work with and show that this affect is not behind language, and this is where I would kind of qualify what I just read, but that it is a function of language itself. We see this in language's performativity, that we cannot ignore sound because language always invokes sound. Even written language demands to be read, to be audiated in a properly musical way. And therefore, the affective is always an immanent quality of the text, which we can see demanded through the presence and the variegated structures of rhythm in Finnegans Wake. And the resistance to the essentializing, generalizing, and reductive tendencies of meter that I discussed earlier with Boulez is not started with Boulez. We can see it echoed in earlier thinkers such as Milton, who in his opening note to Paradise Lost's verse says, "The measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, as that of Homer in Greek and of Virgil in Latin. Rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse. In no longer works especially, but the invention of a barbarous age, to set off wretched matter and lame meter. Graced indeed, since by the use of some famous modern poets, carried away by custom, but much to their own vexation, hindrance and constraint to express many things otherwise, and for the most part worse than else they would have expressed them. Not without cause, therefore, some both Italian and Spanish poets of prime note have rejected rhyme, both in longer and shorter works, as have also long since our best English tragedies, as a thing of itself, to all judicious ears, trivial and of no true musical delight, which consists only in apt numbers, fit quantity of syllables, and the sense of variously drawn out from one verse into another, not in the jingling sound of like endings, a fault avoided by the learned ancients, both in poetry and all good oratory. This neglect, then, of rhyme, so little is to be taken for a defect, though it may seem so, perhaps, to vulgar readers, that it rather is to be esteemed an example set, the first in English, of ancient liberty recovered to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming." And of course, this is a very dogmatic and rhetorically inflected way of resisting rhyme. But what's important is that the reason he's resisting rhyme is the same reason that Boulez, and therefore Deleuze and Guattari, want to resist meter. That it is a dogmatic imposition of a single framework which tries to reduce the excesses of language, of thought, of interpretation. It assumes that in order to explicate, to act, to speak, to think, we have to have some sort of schema which first imposes itself in a properly cognitive sort of way, that things only work if they make sense to us. And Milton is rejecting that. He's saying that no. In fact, language has a rhythm of its own that doesn't depend upon a dogmatic insistence on rhyme. And this is going to be developed after Milton with the onset of Gerard Manley Hopkins discussing sprung rhythm, as he calls it. And sprung rhythm is an attempt to bring back a rhyme scheme which is in accordance with our everyday language, rather than being some sort of academic formalized imposition on language, the likes of which Milton is critiquing. It is an attempt to bring a rhyme back into language that accords with the way we actually use language. And hence, for Hopkins, the solution, and this is the sort of quintessential element that you can pick up in Hopkins's poetry, and important for our purposes, Finnegans Wake, and really all of Joyce, is alliteration. Because alliteration takes rhyme and rhythm, and it sort of finds a middle way, right? A sort of transitionary space where we have a repetition, but one that does not privilege something which has been imposed, but rather a common quality which allows for a zone of intensity to develop. And alliteration is super important in Finnegans Wake because it allows us to see these spaces develop through time, through an emphasis on rhythm, on the feeling of the tongue in our mouth, of the way the air pitter-patters out of our mouth, the way that it is received by our auditory capacities. All of this is so important for Finnegans Wake. Perhaps my favorite instance of this is on page 250 of Finnegans Wake. Spick-spuck, spoken. So now be hushy, little pukers. Side here, rohish. Cleany fooglers, grandicillies, all stayed city. Adultero, test as before, for you've jolly welly dawdled all the day. When ye coif tantacles hat, then'll be a large temps for that. Yet's the time for being now, now, now. For a burning world is coming to dance inane. Glamours hath moidered leap, and therefore caulders must leap no more. Lack breath must leap no more. Lell lolls for Libelman's liebling his lore. Lo, lo, Liberman, ye love to be leaving Libnius. Lift your right to your Liber lord. Link your left to your lass of liberty. La, 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 leapermen, your leps but a loop to lee. A fork of hazel o'er the field invokes the vervine virgin's ode. If you cross this road as you roam the rand, I'm blessed, but you'd feel him a blasting rod. Behind me, freeze from evil smells, perdition stinks before us. So we can see here that we've got sort of 4 different paragraphs with very different rhythms for each one and different alliterative functions. One of them is focusing on L sounds, one of them is focusing on the V sound, the Vox for Vervine Virgin's Ode. And we can see this one, the For a Burning World is Come to Dance Inane, this is a reference to Macbeth. So he's implicating a very popular idiom, which is the Shakespearean idiom. But then after that, he's switching to a highly alliterative prose, which forces us to remove the fetters of anything other than the primary focus on the tongue and the minimal fetters of the tongue in allowing for rhythm to come forth. It forces us to see rhythm as something essential to language and something that we're doing all the time, but Joyce is merely just bumping it up to the next level. Just like Boulez is doing. He's showing the importance of these zones of intensity that we're always building and just accentuating them to the nth degree. So this is the importance of rhythm in Finnegans Wake. It allows for a confluence of performance, interpretation, thought, and concept and form, all in one brilliant gesture. It is a sort of fulminating gestalt that we see developing throughout the work. And I think it's really interesting to keep this in mind if you're reading Finnegans Wake or any text, because I agree with Gabriel Rengli in Joyce as Theory, who says that in this regard, Finnegans Wake is no exemplary text. It is showing us the stuff that we do with language all the time. It is just making it more explicit. But it's not actually doing something wholly new in this regard. Rhythm is in all language, in all identity, in all progressive development of any kind, right? Any articulation invokes a rhythm of some kind, and that is the importance of rhythm in Finnegans Wake. So that being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate any amount of money one time to the channel, because it helps me purchase all the many books necessary to deliver y'all this content, and I appreciate anything that anyone gives. Thank you so much, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.